In this episode of Children of Heroes, we travelled about 1 hour northwest from London to Oxford, where we talked to Mr. William Schiller, son of Captain Hynek Schiller.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your father served in the Czechoslovak army in the United Kingdom during the Second World War. Could you tell us about how he got from Czechoslovakia to England?
We don't know all of the details. My father was born in Prague in 1920, and his family had a textiles, haberdashery, department store at the bottom of Wenceslas Square in Prague. And this was a family business, and I'm sure it was anticipated that he and probably his brother and sister would work in this store. But it was taken over first by the Germans and then by the communists. So unfortunately this store is no longer in the hands of the family, and my father could never go back there. I really love this diary that my father kept as a boy between, as you can see here, 1931, when he was 11, up until around about 1937. Interestingly, in German. So at home he spoke German, at school he spoke Czech. We have this sort of two languages going on. And you can see all the way through a kind of, you have a feeling of an idyllic childhood. These are his holidays. In many of the days he writes in German ganz ungeheuer, which means really cool or fantastic in English. So you have this impression of, as I say, of a idyllic childhood in and around Prague, going on holiday to Austria, Switzerland and Germany. What is interesting, perhaps, is that in 1938 he came to the UK, so soon after this diary finishes, but you don't have any of that in here. This is the diary of a childhood, seemingly without any knowledge, anticipation of what was going to happen. He was sent to the UK in about 1938 to study at Textile College in Bradford. It was 1938, he came by himself and he left his family in Czechoslovakia. And then the war broke out and he joined the Czech regiment of the British Army. Mm-hmm. We know that he was sent to France, and we know that he was in France in 1940. He was caught behind enemy lines in France, and so he couldn't return with the rest of the military to the UK, but he had to travel across France, obviously behind enemy lines, which must have been quite a perilous undertaking. And eventually he got to Lisbon in Portugal, which was a neutral country, via Spain and Casablanca in northern Africa. And actually here are, you don't see these anymore, these are telegrams, which he sent from Marseille to his parents in London, just presumably notifying them that he was still alive, because they wouldn't have known that that was the case. What we have here is a letter which he sent from Lisbon to his mother and father, who at that stage were living, and many years after, were living in Lidford Road, which is in London. He says in this letter that he's safe and well in Lisbon, and he talks about his journey to get to Lisbon via Marseille and North Africa. And then he says, it's a good feeling to be in a really neutral country again, to be able to buy and read the Daily Telegraph. So that was obviously important to him. To see a town full of lights and life, to be able to say where you're ultimately going, in one word, to be really happy again. I met lots of friends, and then he mentions his friends. There was obviously a small Czech community at that stage in Lisbon. And then he says, I still have a lot to do before I leave here, which will be rather soon. For instance, I have not yet been to the exhibition 800 Years, Portugal. So, despite being in the midst of a world war, despite having travelled for many months through Europe, and you can only imagine the kind of the suffering and pain that must have engendered, he still wishes to go to a local exhibition before he leaves Lisbon. So it's really interesting that, you know, you can imagine the situation. His parents were very, very anxious about him, probably hadn't heard from him for many months. And he writes a letter. That was the only means of communication. And the letter says that he's well and he's returning, but before he returns, he needs to go and visit this exhibition. And he made his way from Lisbon in November 1940 to the UK. So that was his first experience of the Second World War.
In France, he also served as a liaison officer for displaced officers.
So that came a lot later. So he had 2 further periods of service with the British Army. So in 1945, in around August 1944, in fact 1944, he went to France and served with the Czech regiment in France in 1944. He was actually discharged, his notes say, towards the end of that year because he had an ear problem. In fact, throughout his life, he had hearing difficulties. He was virtually deaf. So he served during 1944. He was then discharged on medical grounds. And then after the end of the war, he worked as a liaison officer for the British Army, and that involved him travelling, we believe, to concentration camps, or a concentration camp, in Europe to help with the resettlement of Czech prisoners of war or Czech people who had been displaced through the war. So he was doing that work in 1946.
After the end of the war, he returned to the United Kingdom. What did he do here?
So after the end of the war, he returned to textile training in northern England, and then he joined a textile business. And as far as I know, he worked after the war, and in fact for many years subsequently, in the textile business. He joined a firm owned by Marcel Boussac, so a French textile firm, and he worked as the agent for this company in London. Ultimately, he left when Boussac went bust, and he worked on his own accord as an agent in his own right during the later stages of his life. This is a copy of his naturalisation certificate from 1948, when he was back and living with his parents in Lidford Road in North London. Here you can see his occupation, export manager, textiles. And here you can see that he swears allegiance by Almighty God to King George VI and his heirs. So that might date from when he went back to Prague after the war. I'm not really sure.
His hobby was Shakespeare.
He had a few hobbies, yeah. He was a very cultured, intellectual, charming man, in fact. And he loved Shakespeare, and he loved drama, and he loved going to the theatre. And he himself acted in amateur dramatics societies, one group before I was born, and then subsequently he acted with a group that's called the Old Stagers, which is, it's claimed, the oldest amateur dramatic society in the world. And every year they put on a play in Canterbury, and he acted with them. His children, me included, we also acted in this troupe. One of his passions was Shakespeare and the theatre, yes. So this is a betting slip. So these are the horses that he bet on in August 1954. It doesn't say where it was, but he was very keen on horse racing. So that was one of his other passions, going to the races.
You yourself were born almost 2 decades after the end of the war. Did you grow up with Czechoslovak education and habits, or were you a purely English family?
I must say we were a purely English family, yes. I mean, obviously my father had friends and work colleagues indeed who were Czech, and they would visit, and then one heard this strange foreign language in the house, but ultimately we were a typical middle-class English family. I went to local school, and I went to then public school, and then to university, all the normal sort of things that middle-class English kids do. So there was no Czech spoken in our house. But one always had this sense that, you know, that my father was somewhat different from maybe the other fathers of my school colleagues because of this accent that he had, of course, all through his life. And as I say, the family and some of his friends, you had a strong sense of the sort of Central European background that my father had.
You later studied at Cambridge University. What was your major?
I studied in history. Lots of different periods of history, yeah. Going back to the Middle Ages, all sorts of periods, yeah.
And did you like it?
I liked being at Cambridge, yeah. I liked university life. There was lots of interesting people to meet and to socialise with, and there was lots of sports, and there was a bit of education as well. And yeah, I very much enjoyed that, yeah.
But you started to work as an accountant for leading global companies.
Yeah,
Why an accountant? History.
Because history doesn't naturally lead to any particular career. I guess I was looking for a career in business, and an accounting qualification affords you an introduction, an entree into the world of business, and that's why I chose accountancy. I initially worked for a medium-sized firm in London, and after 3 years with them I went to a much larger global firm, also based in London, KPMG, and I spent, about, 20 years or something all told with KPMG in London initially. I had 2 years in Munich on secondment, then I came back to the UK, and then in 1999 we all went to Switzerland, where I also worked with KPMG for a couple of spells. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Have you ever been to places your father came from?
So we visited Prague a couple of times in the 90s. So once we went in 1993, before our first son was born, whilst Prague was kind of developing and reorientating itself after the revolution. So that was very interesting. And then we went a few years later after our second son had been born. So we've been for a couple of family holidays, but not more than that. Yeah.
Would you say that your father's Czech origin had an impact on your life?
I think it had an impact on but probably my siblings' character. We were quite sort of European in our outlook, very interested in the arts and culture in the way that my father was, and very interested in languages. And my father spoke a lot of languages, obviously Czech and German from when he was growing up, and then English and French. He worked for a French firm. So I think that has certainly had an influence on me and my siblings, a love of Europe and a love of languages and culture. I think we've inherited those features from him, yeah.